Hello and welcome to the Explore Africa series. How are we all doing? Good. So today we're going to be learning about African resistance to colonialism. Introduction. So African resistance to colonialism represents a pivotal chapter in the continent's history marked by courageous struggles against foreign domination and exploitation. From armed uprisings to diplomatic negotiations, Africans fiercely resisted colonial rule, striving to safeguard their independence, cultures, and sovereignty. Let's delve into the inspiring stories of African resistance, exploring the strategies, leaders, and legacies that shaped the fight against colonial oppression. So does anyone know what colonialism means? Yes, what does colonialism mean? Colonialism is where you go to a place and you force the people of that place to be like the country that you're from. So it's like you go into a town in Spain and you tell everybody in that town in Spain that you want them to be English. So they've got to eat English food, they've got to wear English clothes, they've got to speak the language, how they walk, how they teach, everything they do. You basically want them to be a miniature version of the home country that you're from. So that's what colonialism is. And throughout the African continent, there were quite a lot of the countries that were colonized. And I think there's only one country that did not. I think it was one country, and that was Ethiopia. Ethiopia never succumbed to colonialism.
Also 53.
So yeah, but all the other countries in some way were impacted by colonialism. The beautiful thing about why we are learning about this is just so that you can know that even though the African continent was impacted by colonialism, we must not forget that there were lots of brave men and women that resisted. And resist means to say, no, we don't want this, that fought, that tried so many ways to be free and resist, but unfortunately, in most cases, at some point, they failed. And the primary reason why they failed is what we're going to be looking at. And most of the times it had to do with the fact that the people that were trying to colonize them were militarily much more powerful. So they had ammunition, they had weapons that were much more powerful than the weapons of the various ethnic groups on the continent of Africa. So as we usually do, we will look at objectives, and the first one is we're going to learn about how Africans resisted colonial powers by fighting back. Secondly, we're going to discover some of the important leaders and the methods and their approach in fighting against colonialism. And thirdly, we're going to think about how African resistance to colonialism has impacted Africa even after colonialism has ended. So we see early forms of resistance. So there was localized revolts. So Africans resisted colonial rule through localized revolts and uprisings, often sparked by injustices such as forced labor, land seizures, and discriminatory policies. And then there were also indigenous leadership. So some of these resistant movements were often led by indigenous leaders like tribal chiefs, religious figures, community elders, and people who generally rallied against colonial oppression. So what we see is that the Africans that resisted, we see that they're demonstrating something that is innate in us as humans, which is no human wants to be dominated by another human. So the natural cause is to resist, right? So make sure that in everything that you do, never let anybody erode your resistance, right? If something is wrong, if something you're not happy with, you resist. You don't have to capitulate and be like, oh yeah, you know what, I give up. Yeah, have your way. You resist because that's your innate ability, the God-given ability that you have. So, and then we see that there were armed struggles. So Some resistance effort escalated into armed conflicts, such as the Maji Maji Rebellion in the German East Africa, which is now Tanzania. And again, the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, where Africans fought bravely against colonial forces. And again, we see that there was also collaborative efforts. So resistance movements sometimes involved alliances between various ethnic groups, because the continent of Africa is the most diverse group of people that you can find in the world, right? So these groups all came together, different groups, right, came together because they're like, our freedom is important to us. We don't want to be dominated by another person. So they united by a common goal of challenging colonial authority and reclaiming their autonomy. Then we move on to later on, they started figuring out the system at play, and they had to, educate themselves in the system of the colonial powers. And so they now decided to form political alliances. And some of that is what we see here. So they had diplomatic channels. So African leaders utilized diplomatic channels to challenge colonial rule, advocating for their rights and sovereignty through petitions, appeals to international organizations, and participation in conferences. So you see, the more that African people were aware of the system in power, and knowing their rights, their human rights, their rights, under the UN charters and everything else, they were now using those laws to fight back. And obviously, it's very difficult for you to try and beat somebody that knows their rights. And over the same decade, if you will, a lot of African countries gained their liberation from colonial rule. So that's why Independence Day, for example, is celebrated, across the continent, and different countries have different dates for their day of independence, right? So these were some of the diplomatic channels that they were using, which was using the law, using what the rights were, and obviously petitioning that to the colonial powers. So there were different colonial powers. You had the Portuguese, you had the British, you had the Germans, you had the Belgians, you had the Spanish. All these different groups were colonial powers over different parts of Africa. And so as a consequence, there was also formation of nationalist movements. So nationalist movements emerged across Africa, advocating for self-rule and independence from colonial powers. And we had leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya leading the charge. So these were very, very prominent people. And one of the things that's so admirable about Kwame Nkrumah was that he was a Pan-Africanist. Now, a Pan-Africanist is somebody that believes that all African people, are one, that there has to be unity, that we have to see ourselves as one in order to fight, the oppressor, right? So he was very Pan-Africanist. So one of the qualities about Kwame Nkrumah was the fact that because he was a Pan-Africanist and he believed in the unity of all black people, irrespective of where you were on the continent or in the diaspora, whether it was the Caribbean, the Americas, or Europe, he believed that we were all supposed to unite. We're all supposed to unite. And if you notice, there are quite a number of countries in Africa that they've got similar colours of their flags, like the green, yellow, and red. Yes. So like Ghana, Senegal. There's so many countries that have those flags. I can't even list them. But it was because it came from that Pan-African theme. Again, we see that another way that they tried to resist was boycotts and protests. So remember, the first type of resistance was the early resistance was them using whatever arms that they had, which was their spears and whatever means that they had, they were using it to fight. And then as they progressed, they realized that this enemy we have to fight using the law, we have to fight using knowledge. So we see that politically they were going to places like the UK and all, to meet with these colonial powers and demand for their rights, demand for their freedom. And then here we see that they also use boycotts and protests. You organize a large group of people and you say, look, there is power in numbers. Let's go, let's carry placards, let's go to a very public place and let's show the world and show people that we're not having this. So that's what you see going on there, boycotts and protests. So sometimes a boycott is maybe people are buying food from a particular store and maybe that store has really been dealing badly. So what will happen is people will say, we're not going to buy anything from that store. We'd rather walk 1 hour to the next store to buy stuff. And then that store is impacted because they're not making any more money, right? So that's how a boycott can occur. And then a protest is to find a central place, get large groups of numbers and say, look, let's write placards like we're not having this. We are entitled to our freedom. You have to listen to us. And we just walk around that place. And because there's so many of us, they have to listen. They have to come out. They have to respond, right? So this was another mechanism that, African people on the continent used to try and resist colonial rule. So Africans organized boycotts, strikes and protests against colonial policies, demonstrating their discontent and demanding political reforms, economic justice and social equality. And the image that you can see there is one that was taken in South Africa, and I believe it was Indians and black South Africans that were protesting about the injustices due to apartheid. So we see another form of political resistance that was so powerful was the intellectual resistance. And African intellectuals, writers and activists played a crucial role in mobilizing resistance through writing, speeches and grassroots organizing, raising awareness and galvanizing support for anti-colonial movements. So we had powerful writers like Chinua Achebe, like so many of them that would write, poets, right? That would speak about the ill that was being done in the world against African people. So it's very powerful. So when you think to yourself, I don't have anything, that's not true. There's always something that you can use to demonstrate your cause for, your fight for a cause. It could be your pen, it could be your voice, it could be your thoughts, but we all have something that we can use to show that we're not having that. We're not going to be bullied. We're not going to allow somebody dominate us, right? Because we're not supposed to be dominated by anyone. We're supposed to dominate the earth. We're supposed to dominate our work in such a way that we're the experts, not each other. When you're dominating people, that's abuse. When a parent dominates a child, that's child abuse. When a husband dominates his wife, that is spousal abuse. When a person dominates a group of people, that's slavery, right? We're not supposed to dominate each other in that way. We're supposed to support each other. We're supposed to be there for each other, right? And so whenever you find a situation where somebody's being dominated, it's important to resist. It's important to resist because that is your right of life. So now we see the cultural resistance. So preservation of indigenous cultures. Africans preserved their indigenous cultures and traditions as acts of resistance against colonial assimilation policies, safeguarding languages, customs and rituals. So remember what I said is like, for example, a small town in Spain, and you go to it and you're like, this people in this town, I want you to be English. You have to eat only English food. You have to speak only English language. You should not speak Spanish. If I catch you speaking Spanish, it's jail, right? You must go to English schools. You must understand the English legal system. Everything about you's got to be English, even though you're Spanish, right? So in order for people to preserve what was authentically them, they would find ways of making sure that they did not lose that culture. So sometimes it could be that they were, speaking their language in secret, maybe when everyone's asleep, right? Or keeping some things that they could use to cook their food so that they still have that connection, right? Unfortunately, the African people that were taken across the Atlantic, they lost all of that, right? There was no connection. So for them, because they were outside, they were isolated from the main group of people, there's no how that they'd be able to remember that part of their heritage. But for the people that were on the continent that were still in their groups, somehow they were able to safeguard and they were able to hold on to their culture. They did not lose their identity. Then we see that artistic expressions, artists, musicians and storytellers use their creative talents to resist colonialism, producing works that celebrated African identity, critiqued colonial oppression and inspired resilience. So this would have happened in the forms of storytelling where they would use imagery and certain types of maybe animals or descriptions to illustrate the oppression that Africans were facing. And this is all part of history. Now, again, the image that you can see is of some of the artifacts that were stolen from the Benin Empire. Look at the intricacy of that sculpture, that beautiful art piece, showcasing the brilliance, the power, the richness of African heritage. And over here we see educational initiatives. So African communities established clandestine schools and educational initiatives to counter colonial indoctrination, empowering future generations with knowledge of their history, heritage and rights. So here we see that African people were like, look, if we don't do something, we are going to lose all our values. So while we don't have the power to stop, the infiltration of colonial education, we're going to make sure that at the same time we are teaching our children about our culture, our identity, the way we do things, our values, right? Our community values, our sense of family, right? We have to teach our children these things. So whilst children were going to the colonial schools, they also had a means of making sure that they were teaching them about their culture so that they never forgot. Religious movements. So we see that religious leaders and movements such as the Ethiopian Church and the Mahdiya in Sudan inspired resistance against colonialism by promoting spiritual renewal, unity and moral defiance. So we can see that the three popular ways in which Africans resisted colonial rules was they used the arms, the weapons that they had, which was inferior to what the colonial powers had, right? Because the colonial powers, they had gunpowder, right? Which could do a lot more harm. And then we see that there was political resistance, which involved the mind. So that involved the intellectual side of the argument in defending for their freedom. And then we see the cultural resistance, which talked about art, their identity, who they are as people, what the values were. And so they resisted. Quiz. Question 1. How did Africans resist colonial rule? A. Armed uprisings and rebellions. B. Diplomatic protests and petitions. C. Cultural preservation and defiance. Question 2. Who were some influential leaders in the fight against colonialism? A. Nelson Mandela. B. Kwame Nkrumah. C. Patrice Lumumba. Question 3. What were some forms of political resistance against colonial powers? A. Boycotts and strikes. C. Formation of nationalist movements. C. Participation in international conferences. Question 4. How did Africans preserve their cultures as acts of resistance? A. safeguarding languages and customs. B, celebrating indigenous traditions and rituals. C, promoting artistic expressions and cultural events. Question 5. What role did diplomatic channels play in challenging colonial authority? A, advocating for African rights and sovereignty. B, seeking support from international organizations. C, negotiating treaties and agreements with colonial powers. All right, here are the answers. All right, so conclusion. So we see the courageous struggles of Africans. So Africans fought bravely against colonial oppression, using diverse strategies to protect their independence and cultures, right? They had influential leaders, so visionary leaders spearheaded resistance movements, inspiring hope and unity among their people. And then finally, enduring legacy. The legacy of African resistance to colonialism continues to resonate, shaping post-colonial Africa and inspiring global struggles for justice and freedom. So one of the reasons of colonialism in Nigeria, for example, is what? Can you name one aftermath of colonialism in Nigeria? What's the impact of colonialism on Nigeria? The fact that Nigerians speak English is an impact for colonialism. If there was no British influence in Nigeria, more than likely everybody would be speaking their own language. On the continent, people will be speaking their own language, just as you have the French speaking French, the Germans speaking Germans, the Dutch speaking Dutch, the English speaking English, the Spaniards speaking Spanish, right? The Portuguese speak Portuguese and stuff like that. You've got all of those. So the impact of colonialism is that people speak the languages of the colonial powers. Not only that, the clothes you wear are influenced by those regions as well, right? And not only that, the legal system sometimes is impacted by that. So there are just so many reasons that you can list the impact of colonialism on the various continents.